I'd like to welcome all of you to today's event. I know many of you, but I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Claude Destray. I'm a member of the faculty at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, and I collect titles as a hobby. So I'm the director of the Human Rights Degree Program, the Center on Rights Development, and the Human Trafficking Center. But for the first time since I joined the faculty at DU in 2002, I can add one of my other titles, which I never get to use, which is that I'm also the Buddhist chaplain here at the University Denver. I should begin by, of course, giving our thanks to John de Blasio, who has become a very good friend of the Joseph Corbell School and the Middle East Center, and our sincere thanks for your sponsoring, your real sponsoring of this event. My colleagues over there, some of them are there, Professor Nader Shemi, Dr. Danny Postel, Mr. Douglas Garrison, who are all my colleagues at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the Corbell School. Professor Gregory Robbins and Professor Andrea Stanton of the Department of Religious Studies. Are you folks here, either one, or is that for a later, probably a later meeting? You have nonstop meetings, I think, today. The Office of Religious and Spiritual Life under the person who is shepherding, I think that's the proper term, that process, our university chaplain, the Reverend Dr. Gary Brower, good friend and colleague, and the undergraduate and graduate student group, the Interfaith Advocates. Dr. Eboo Patel is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Core, that's spelled C-O-R-E, as I have read in the interviews, otherwise known as of course everything has to have an acronym, the IFYC, which is a Chicago-based organization building the interfaith movement on college campuses like ours. He's the author of the books Acts of Faith, The Story of an American Muslim, The Struggle for the Soul of a Generation, and Sacred Ground, Pluralism, Prejudice, and the Promise of America, both of which are back there, and you'll be signing, yes, for those who would like, and his forthcoming book, Interfaith Leadership, a primer. Dr. Patel holds a doctorate in sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. So occasionally, I have to actually bend my knee as a Harvard graduate to an older institution, so dutifully done. That was hard to do. Both Dr. Patel and the IFYC were honored with the Roosevelt Institute's Freedom of Worship Medal in 2009, and he was recently awarded the Guru Nanak Interfaith Prize, which is an award given to an individual to enhance awareness of crucial role of religious dialogue in the pursuit of peace. We are also happy to announce today that the Department of Religious Studies and the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies is proposing a brand new graduate certificate program on religion and international relations. So we are hoping that will be in place, if all goes well, dealing with our academic institutions by the end of this academic year, so it can be started in the autumn of the next academic year. I'm very interested in hearing what Dr. Patel has to say today. From what I've read in his interviews, it seems clear that he and the Interfaith Youth Core put their emphasis on the commonality between religious and spiritual traditions. I have spent decades in interfaith dialogue and have often been made a, quote, honorary Christian. I presume that the person and persons bestowing that particular honorific on me did it with a good heart. I often found it, however, naive and sometimes insulting. I'm one of those that, while happy to discuss common ground between religious, spiritual, and secular traditions, I'm just as interested, if not more interested, in celebrating their differences. I also think that before we can talk about interfaith dialogue, we need to have significant intra-faith dialogue. Dr. Patel, I'm very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome to Dr. Eboo Patel.
Thank you. Well, given those challenges, the Q&A session is not going to be boring. Thank you for those, Claude. And thank you all for coming. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I remember when John de Blasio and I were first talking about potentially me coming and what an event like this would look like. his point was, we ought to really encourage something like a graduate certificate in religion and international affairs. I'm like, well, I will prepare a talk just to that end. You have clearly already done that. So I'm hoping that my talk is a view, a biased and partial view as to one way to carry that out. And as I put this argument forward, I'm hoping at the very least it stirs up an even more exciting Q&A session. Let me also say that Secretary Albright has been an early encourager of Interfaith Youth Corps and something of a mentor to the organization and myself. And so in kind of my early conversations with her about this in 2005, 2006, she would always say, we have to find a way to get you to the Corbell School. So my eye has been on this prize for a very long time. So I'm extremely grateful to all of you, especially to Danny and to John and to Claude and to folks who helped make this happen. And actually, my talk begins with her. So in 2004, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright came to Yale Divinity School to deliver a talk called The Mighty and the Almighty on the subject of religion and foreign policy. In that talk, and in the book of the same title that followed, Secretary Albright spoke of the profound shift in her understanding of foreign policy, from an endeavor where faith identity was irrelevant to one in which understanding the energies around religion was essential. She had come of age in an era that celebrated modernity, a time in which the best sociologists assumed the process of modernization inevitably led to secularization. She speaks of it as a historical moment where foreign policy specialists studied George Kennan and Dean Acheson, paid close attention to the political ties of nationalism and socialism, and rarely mentioned God in public or viewed religion as a force to be reckoned with at all. When Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington wrote The Clash of Civilizations in the mid-1990s, Albright says, "We did all we could to distance ourselves from that theory. We had in mind a future in which nations and regions drew closer as democratic bonds drew stronger, not a world splitting apart along historic fault lines of culture and creed." Even the foreign policy issues she dealt with in the Clinton administration, the Balkans, Northern Ireland, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, she and her colleagues viewed in solely secular terms the rights of individuals, the dividing lines of land. God and religion were nowhere near. 9/11, of course, shifted the paradigm, showing that the path ahead would mix religion and foreign policy in profound ways. But it also cast a light backwards, illuminating how the foreign affairs issues of the 1990s were shot up with religious energies. In her book, Secretary Albright recalls many situations from her foreign policy career that, in retrospect, had profound religious dimensions. She talks of how the visit of Pope John Paul II to Poland energized the anti-communist movement, and how the return of the Ayatollah to Iran took the American foreign policy establishment by surprise. She writes about the emergence of faith-based extremist movements like Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army and Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, the religious issues that complicated the Middle East negotiations, and the faith-fueled conflicts raging across the world. It turns out that those 1960s-era sociologists were wrong. The world is not necessarily heading down a path of disbelief. One particularly prominent secularization theorist, Peter Berger, revised his view with the pithy line, "The world is as furiously religious as ever, and in some cases, more so." Arguably, issues around religion may be more important in the next 20 years than they were in the past 20. There's a great deal of attention paid to whether nations undergoing transitions to democracy, Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, to name a few, can build democracies that are stable and representative, and economies that employ a reasonable percentage of their people. But even a quick glance at the New York Times on any given day shows that an equally important question is how groups who orient around religion differently within those nations are going to relate to one another. Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds in Iraq, Sufis and Salafis in Tunisia, Ikhwanis, secular Muslims, and Christians in Egypt. The list goes on and on and on. This is true beyond the Middle East. Who knew there was a group called Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and that the storybook democratic opening of that nation would be marred by violence between an extremist Buddhist movement and that Muslim minority? Nations undergoing a transition to democracy are likely the most vulnerable to the type of interreligious civic conflict that we focus on in international studies programs, precisely because the sectarian-oriented authoritarian governments that ruled before gave favor to some groups, fomenting reprisals when those dictatorships are overthrown. But this is a dynamic that is relevant to a whole range of societies, not just ones undergoing transitions to democracy. Tensions still simmer between the Catholics and Protestants of Northern Ireland, as well as the Serbian Orthodox Christians and the Bosnian Muslims of the Balkans. Christian-Muslim conflict within Nigeria is a significant problem, and sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shias in Pakistan has resulted in the outright murder of hundreds of mostly Shia Muslims in recent years. The growing Muslim populations across Europe are being met with increasing restrictions on their religious liberties, the banning of headscarves, the limiting of mosques, not to mention vicious nativist movements. Furthermore, this is not simply an over-there problem. The United States is the most religiously diverse nation in human history and the most religiously devout nation in the West at this moment of global religious conflict. Mitt Romney's run for president revealed ugly anti-Mormon strains among some segments of the American population. In the past several years, dozens of mosques have encountered opposition by city councils and citizens groups, some of it violent, as an arson. 50% of Americans report that they would not vote for an atheist or humanist for president, and more than a few atheists in recent years have made their name and sold a lot of books by taking an aggressively hostile stance to all forms of religion. Moreover, we have diaspora groups from each of the communities fighting elsewhere right here in America, living cheek by jowl. Those groups feel deeply connected to the fate of their co-religionists elsewhere. When violence occurs between Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East, tensions rise between Jewish and Muslim groups in the Midwest. The term diversity in professional and educational circles in the United States is frequently mentioned as positive on its face, needing no justification. Diversity is our strength. Diversity enriches us. These are common statements. But Harvard professor of comparative religions Diana Eck points out that diversity is simply a demographic fact, a situation in which people with different identities live in close quarters. The term says nothing about how those people get along with one another. Frankly, if all we knew about religious diversity was the stories carried on the international news, it would be hard to conclude anything but that it is a recipe for conflict. Recent social science provides a window into the complexities around diversity. Robert Putnam, in his Skite lecture, found that the most common result of diversity within a city is that it causes people to, quote, hunker down, isolating themselves and eroding social capital. This creates a vacuum for groups invested in spreading prejudice or building barriers to sow the seeds of division and conflict. And religious conflict can be especially deadly. Not only do the participants believe they are fighting for cosmic reasons, where death may be welcomed as martyrdom, but religious communities are the largest repositories of social capital in many civil societies, providing endless amounts of energy, people, and resources to mobilize. But what if the social capital between religious communities could be bridged, and people who orient around religion differently can be convinced to cooperate with one another? What if the cosmic narratives of religious traditions could be nudged to consider the religious other as a partner in the quest for the kingdom on earth? Many of the great social movements of the 20th century, Hind Swaraj in India, the civil rights movement in the United States, the struggle in South Africa, had a profound interfaith character. What if the great line from the 1893 Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, "From now on, the great religions of the world make war no longer on each other, but on the giant of evils that afflict humankind"? What if that line could be made a reality? I believe the best way to achieve this is to prepare a critical mass of interfaith leaders, and I believe that schools of international studies are ideally positioned to do just that. I'm defining an interfaith leader as someone with the framework, knowledge base, and skill set to help individuals and communities who orient around religion differently build mutual respect, positive relationships, and a commitment to the common good. Put simply, an effective interfaith leader is one who can work with diversity to build pluralism. I'm defining diversity with Diana Eck as simply the fact of people with different identities living in close quarters. Pluralism is an achievement characterized by three things. Number one, respect for different identities. Number two, positive relationships between diverse communities. And number 3, a commitment to the common good. Diverse societies that achieve pluralism have a strong civic fabric, one that can withstand the provocations of extremists and haters, and are bridging their social capital in ways that can take on some of the toughest social problems of that society. But bridges don't fall from the sky, and they don't rise from the ground. People build them. And the people who are on the vanguard of such work, we call leaders. I want to spend most of the rest of this talk sketching out a program of study that I believe will prepare students to be interfaith leaders. But before I do that, I want to point out that interfaith leadership is part of a growing multidisciplinary research field called interfaith studies. This field examines the various dimensions of how individuals and groups who orient around religion differently interact with one another, and the implications those interactions have for civil society and politics. A psychologist might research how individuals who grow up in a religiously homogeneous environment experience and cope with moving to religiously diverse surroundings. A political scientist could study why some nations have been more effective in absorbing religious minorities than others, or why politics is dominated by religion in some states and not in others, and perhaps the relationship between the two. A historian would draw parallels between the relatively tolerant empires of medieval Islam and contemporary North America. A sociologist might look at the role religious institutions play in assimilating immigrants. Philosophers might compare paradigms of pluralism. Theologians would elucidate how to be Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist amongst others. Professors of art and literature could choose to examine any of 1,000 great works that have been created at the crossroads of religious imaginations. The point is that as we develop programs of study that train practitioners, these courses, as in fields like urban studies, education, public health, in fact, in international studies, such courses rely on research being done upstream. Let me move on to describing a course sequence in interfaith leadership that a student might take as part of a graduate or undergraduate degree in international studies. By the way, if you are wondering whether I was the type of geeky graduate student who would sit in coffee shops daydreaming about designing course sequences, I was indeed said geeky graduate student, and it is in fact a dream come true to sketch out in public that course sequence for you. So here goes. The foundational course in my imagined concentration or certificate in interfaith leadership would be called Religious Diversity, Civil Society, and Global Politics. And the first text assigned would be Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. The first assignment would be to read Huntington alongside a week's worth of the New York Times and come to class attempting to argue against Huntington's thesis. If it is a typically bloody week, there will be far more that seems to illustrate Huntington than seemingly disproves him. The discussion will hopefully raise a series of questions that the rest of the coursework will attempt to answer. The first question is about religious trends. Huntington was one of the first prominent academics to say that the secularization theory was bunk, that religious identity was deeply ingrained in the human condition, and most of humanity was likely to identify most closely with their faith for the foreseeable future. 20 years after the Clash of Civilizations, what do we know about trends in religious identification? And not simply about the number of adherents of different religions across the globe, but also about diversity within cities, nations, and regions, and how people's religious orientations shape their attitudes towards everything from polio vaccines to separation of church and state to girls' schooling. The basic question here, how devout and how diverse is our chosen area or region of interest, and how much is that likely to matter for issues of peace and security? The second question that the Huntington conversation is likely to raise is whether conflict between communities who orient around religion differently is in fact inevitable, as Huntington suggests it is. The third question is related to the second. If religious violence is not inevitable, as I think, in what situations have diverse communities coexisted and even cooperated within states and regions? This question, I think, is best answered through the literature of 3 disciplines. The first is history, simply reading about the instances where diversity has become coexistence or cooperation in other times and places. Some of my favorite works in this area include Maria Rosa Menecal's The Ornament of the World, about medieval Spain, and Zachary Karabel's Peace Be Upon You. A second discipline which helps answer this question is political theory, which raises, I think, the hardest and most important questions when it comes to religious diversity, namely, under what political and social conditions can communities who have very different ideas of what is good and lawful on earth, based on a set of cosmic convictions, live together in the same society? This is something of a comment embedded in the talk already of Claude's challenge at the beginning, the challenge of celebrating diversity and differences rather than focusing on commonalities. My own sense, and I think we'll get into this more in the Q&A, is that there's a third way here, if you will, but I want to illustrate just briefly just how challenging it is to deal with religious differences. There is something of a sensibility in the kind of progressive urban circles that I at least run in, that when you're talking about diversity, what you're talking about is interesting ethnic restaurants. Actually, Iraq is diverse. It's also basically a civil war. Syria is diverse. It is amongst, there are experts on this in this room right now, but it is, amongst many other things, basically a civil war. India, the country where I'm from, is very, very diverse. And in some pockets at some times, it is basically a civil war around profound religious disagreements, right? Let me illustrate a particular type of disagreement. Many Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains believe that all of life is holy and should be unharmed, all animals and some vegetables. They share a society, India, with about 170 million Muslims. The second largest Muslim society on the planet happens to be India, interestingly enough. Muslims who believe that slaughtering goats on certain days is holy and eating meat on most other days a very good idea. I am a Muslim and I share that conviction. How can these groups with such basic differences anchored in cosmic convictions be expected to share a society together? Think about this, right? If you are part of the majority Muslim community in India, a group of 800 million people, and you believe that animals are holy such that they should not be eaten, and you elect a government, why shouldn't part of what you hope that government ought to do, especially if it's a government like the BJP with explicitly Hindu symbolism, expression, etc., why shouldn't what you hope part of that government does is ban the eating of meat? Which, by the way, would be a significant violation of a set of very important Muslim rituals. It's an unbelievably prosaic example of how challenging it is for people from different religious communities with very different views of what is good and lawful on earth based on cosmic convictions to share a society together. In fact, I think it is remarkable that it goes so well so much of the time, right? But we're, as who was it who said politics ain't beanbag? Tip O'Neill, right? Well, religious diversity ain't beanbag either, right? We're approaching perhaps the most flammable issue on the planet. These are the kinds of questions that Michael Walzer, Alfred Stepan, and John Courtney Murray, political theorists and philosophers, ask in their works. Finally, I think a third discipline that approaches the question of how do we shape societies in which religious diversity is more likely to become cooperation rather than conflict. A third discipline that approaches that, I think, is sociology. What do we know from people doing empirical work, both ethnographic and quantitative, about how communities who orient differently around religion might get along? Robert Putnam and David Campbell's Magisterial American Grace asks the question how America, as a nation that is both religiously diverse and religiously devout, has remained largely tolerant, even during times of religious tension and conflict elsewhere. Pax Ethnica takes an ethnographic look at a range of highly diverse cities around the world and asks what makes places like Flushing or Marseille largely cooperative. Brown University professor Ashutosh Varshney has a hugely important study of India called Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life, which I would commend to everybody in this room, in which he asks the question, why do some cities in India remain relatively calm during times of communal tension and other cities explode in violence? The answer, after an exhaustive quantitative analysis, the answer is surprisingly simple. The existence of civic networks, Rotary clubs and the like, that bring people from different backgrounds together on a regular basis seem to be the single biggest difference between stability and violence. This is kind of shocking, right? I mean, part of what Varshney does is he says, why does this city with a 70-30 Muslim Hindu-Muslim ratio of about 500,000 people explode in violence and riots, and 50 people die when somebody hands out flyers with a picture of the Hindu god Ganesh stomping on a Quran. Why does it have riots, but a similar city 500 miles away not? And after this exhaustive quantitative analysis, he says it's one thing. The cities that have these civic networks, right, that have interfaith groups, that have Rotary clubs, that have book clubs, that have little leagues or the equivalent, cricket leagues, that bring Hindus and Muslims together in ways that they can come to know one another, in ways that tools like phone trees and email lists are employed, those cities remain calm and peaceful. Right? That's the kind of sociological empirical work that I think is hugely important in shaping a society where people are more likely to get along than to not get along. Because then wow, we ought to be checking the social capital, kind of the civic density and thickness of our cities. If we don't have groups that bring people from different faith backgrounds together, we're in trouble during times of religious tension or violence, which is why I think the work that Catherine and Gary and Paul and others in this room are doing on campus and in Denver is so important. By the way, that answer, the presence, the thickness, the strength of those civic groups and the role that they play in preventing violence, those civic groups don't fall from the sky, right? And they don't rise from the ground. People start them. People continue them, right? Leaders do that. And that's precisely the way I think programs of study in this area are so important. Okay, that was just my first course. You see how deep the geekiness goes? And a second course would be case studies in religious violence and interfaith peace building. This course would present actual instances of religious diversity becoming either conflict or cooperation, and analyzing the role that leaders played in either fanning the flames of conflict or building the bridges of cooperation. Texts would include Mark Juergensmeyer's Terror in the Mind of God, the multi-volume Fundamentalism Project by Scott Appleby and Martin Marty, David Smock's Interfaith Dialogue and Peace Building, and interfaith case studies developed by the Harvard Pluralism Project. Key leadership texts by scholars like Ronnie Heifetz and Howard Gardner would also be employed. You see how I am bending my knee to the Harvard folks now, Claude. Case studies would include everything from how Osama bin Laden mobilized a set of Muslims to build a religious extremist organization like Al-Qaeda, to how Martin Luther King Jr. mobilized racially and religiously diverse people to build a civil rights movement. Some case studies would come right off the front pages of the New York Times, and students would be asked, if you were in Grand Island, Nebraska, when Latino and African American Christians staged a walkout of a factory because the Somali Muslim workers had recently won a schedule change to accommodate Ramadan hours, how would you lead? That question, how would you lead, would be at the heart of all the discussions in this class. Akin to the Harvard Business School case study model, which presents students with real-life situations faced by companies and asks them what they would do if they were in charge, this course would constantly be asking the students, how would you strengthen interfaith cooperation in this particular situation when diversity seems to be tending towards conflict? A third course I would require is something along the lines of perspectives in religion. In some ways, this is a typical course offered in most religious studies departments on the nature of religion, with readings by Jose Casanova, Talal Al-Assad, Clifford Geertz, Mircea Eliade, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, Marshall Hodgson, Peter Berger, Rudolph Otto, Paul Tillich, Houston Smith, Stephen Prothero, and the classics Mark Weber and Durkheim. Students would examine various theories of religion. Otto's notion that at the center of religion is an experience that is wholly other, something he calls the numinous. Tillich's view that religion is about ultimate concerns. Cantwell Smith's writings on religion being best understood as cumulative historical traditions, and the term faith best defined as the relationship that individuals and communities have with various dimensions of that tradition. Berger's emphasis on institutions as the plausibility structures that create patterns of activity in human life, and his key insight that what modernity does is pluralize, moving personal identity from fate to choice, making the internal life of human beings far more complex now than in pre-modern times. Students would put scholars like Houston Smith and Stephen Prothero into dialogue with each other, and are religions actually quite similar, as Houston Smith believes, or really very different, as Stephen Prothero thinks? This course will widen perspectives and debunk common myths, like the idea that sacred scripture somehow gets up and walks around by itself with no assistance from human interpreters. That, by the way, was a religious studies joke for the religious studies people in the way. People at AAR laugh at it, I'm not kidding. The final course I would require is Theologies of Interfaith Cooperation. Students would read theologians and ethicists from a range of faiths, including secular humanism, who advance interpretations and narratives of their traditions that speak to positive relationship building with the other. This would include Khalid Abou El Fadl, Farid Esak, Umar Abdallah, Fazlur Rahman, and Ingrid Mattson out of Islam, Jonathan Sachs, Or Rose, Mark Gopin, and Abraham Joshua Heschel out of Judaism, Mahatma Gandhi and Swami Vivekananda from Hinduism, Paul Nitter and Hans Kung from Catholicism, Miroslav Volf and Brian McLaren from Protestant Evangelical Christianity, Thich Nhat Hanh and the Dalai Lama out of Buddhism. The key question of the course would be, how have theologians from a range of traditions stitched together interpretations of scripture, stories, heroes, and historical moments from their key sources to articulate a coherent narrative of positive relationships with the religious other? And how do they navigate some of the most challenging and complex questions? What do Jewish theologians do with the idea of chosenness in relating to the religious other? How do evangelicals view the idea of Christ as the exclusive path to salvation in light of admiring the spiritual example of someone like the Dalai Lama or Gandhi? The core idea here is that positive relations between those who orient around religion differently does not require leaving religion aside. One of the reasons I'm so excited about your program here is because it partners with religious studies. There are plenty of places, plenty of schools of international studies or schools of government that are like, okay, we have to do religion now, but it's entirely instrumental. And religious people who look at them doing religion, they're like, well, wow, I sure wish I recognized the Islam that you're talking about, and that it had something to do with how I understand my tradition, right? So having a partnership between how religion plays out in the world and actual ways that people, adherents and devotees of traditions, actually understand their own traditions is so important. Some of the greatest interfaith leaders of the 20th century, Gandhi and King, to name two obvious ones, built bridges with people of other faiths precisely because of their respective Hindu and Christian faiths, not despite them. Interfaith leaders need to be fluent in the theology of interfaith cooperation of their own tradition and literate in such theologies in other traditions. After this 4-course sequence, I would require 2 electives that could be taken from a range of options. Some students might want to do a deeper dive into religion by taking courses in Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc. Some might want to focus on a particular region, say South Asia or the Middle East. The capstone project would be to write a program proposal for dealing with an interfaith challenge somewhere in the world. The key requirement is to make use of interfaith leaders in civil society to build pluralism out of diversity. As I conclude, I want to return to the place I started. In The Mighty and the Almighty, Secretary Albright noted, when I was Secretary of State, I had an entire bureau of economic experts I could turn to, and a cadre of experts in non-proliferation and arms control. I did not have similar expertise available for integrating religious principles into our efforts at diplomacy. It's an important reminder that ultimately our foreign policy is carried out not by paradigms, but by people. This is the reason that the program I'm outlining above emphasizes nurturing leaders. When those leaders graduate, they will need jobs, and the State Department is one place that I think ought to be interested in hiring them, but it's far from the only place. Staff in international development organizations attempting to spread polio vaccines in South Asia or anti-malarial bed nets in sub-Saharan Africa better be aware of the religious energies in those places. The same is true for people in the armed forces. In fact, just about any career path that you can imagine taking after graduating from the Corbell School in defense, diplomacy, or development will require interfaith knowledge and skills. I understand last night's speaker affirmed the same basic idea. Let's be honest here. For many years, the field of international studies ignored religion. Between 1980 and 1999, the leading journals of international studies published about 1,600 articles in total. Only about 6 of those articles featured religion in any prominent way. Commenting on this narrow view, the prominent international studies theorist Robert Cohen wrote, "The attacks of September 11th reveal that all mainstream theories of world politics are relentlessly secular with respect to motivation. They ignore the impact of religion, despite the fact that world-shaking political movements have so often been fueled by religious fervor. What struck me most is what Professor Cohane went on to say. He writes, "Since I have few insights into religious motivations in world politics, I will leave this subject to those who are more qualified to address it." Prominent theorist of international relations is saying, look, I don't know that much about this. I know it's important, but other people have to take this on. Look, if my meetings with people at the State Department are any indication, I am not sure there are that many of those people, which means that the Corbell School has both a great opportunity and a great responsibility to develop more. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for Q&A, if it's okay with you.
Yeah, of course.
In your last remarks, I was reminded that Doug Johnson and Cynthia Sampson, who are the co-authors of Religion, the Hidden Dimension of Statecraft. Doug, years ago, proposed to the State Department that each U.S. embassy ought to have a religion officer, which has still not happened, and it's been shot down every year under the false concept of separation of church and state as it applies to that position, which is really unfortunate. Do give credit at least a couple administrations ago when the State Department started Interfaith Dialogue, that had an interreligious dialogue group that I was part of, and each religious tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Buddhist tradition, each had. And that came to, quite interestingly, a sudden halt under the Bush administration from pressure from faith-based organizations, Christian faith-based organizations, so the State Department stopped having those kinds of interesting dialogue within the halls of the State Department. So there is some seeds there that I'm delighted that you and others are fanning in terms of taking religion seriously on the ground and as a part and parcel of our foreign diplomacy and foreign policy. Q&A time. So questions. They don't even have to be particularly polite.
Issue challenges, I will refer them here.
Thanks very much for your invitation and faith, education and research. It really got my wheels spinning on a lot of ideas. And I thought it was really interesting how you brought in case studies as an element of studying examples, some good, perhaps some bad, of how cooperation across religions was or was not successfully promoted. But it got me thinking that it's not clear to me that that vision is going to give students or practitioners the education and tools that they're going to need to become effective leaders. And I'm thinking that in part because you may read a lot of cases and see different examples, but I think what we really need as a tool to pull out of those are the mechanisms of interfaith cooperation and the practices and why and when they work. And so in the example that we brought up with Marshall's work, for example, he cites these interfaith associations in India, and that's a good example, but it's still not always clear from that example what the mechanism is through which religious leaders will be able to tamp down conflict and violence. And so I guess my suggestion, something that we can react to, is it possible to introduce, even though we're talking about religion and faith, is it possible to introduce a more scientific viewpoint or perspective on this program of study so that not only are we looking at interesting cases, but we're asking what are the mechanisms by which different religious leaders are able to effect social change. And then not only that, but can we examine those scientifically to understand the conditions under which those may apply or may not. And the fear I have with some of the case study emphasis is that we may see particular cases that are prominent examples of reducing violence, reducing conflict, but we don't know if those are unique examples
Right.
or if they apply
Yeah.
more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think thank you for that. I think that's very interesting. So I'll cut your question out in a couple parts. So I think this would be a huge problem if case study was in the singular. if all we did was read Varshney and say, then it's case study as masquerading as grand theory, right? But, I mean, I imagine a course like this, reading 30 case studies, and an excellent faculty person like you basically saying, you know, look, isn't it interesting that that civic associations seem to have prevented conflict in India, but here's empirical work out of Nigeria, and there's, you know, these thick civic associations, say in the city of Jos, but it's a cauldron of religious conflict. What can we glean from that, right? So I think that I think we are at the beginning of a new interdisciplinary field, right? And I am very suspicious of grand theories in those kinds of cases. And my sense is that the best way you get to a set of things that might work well is by dealing with a range of cases, and not just from the position of, isn't this interesting research, but from the Harvard Business School position of, what would you do if you were in charge? Which is one of the reasons I like making this presentation to in a School of International Studies, because the vast majority of your students are going to be doers, right? They're going to work for World Vision or the State Department or USAID or the Aga Khan Development Network or the Armed Forces, and the question is, what do I do? My sense is the best training for that is to not only examine 30 different cases, but to actually put yourself in the position and say, if I was the person who, if I was the World Vision staffer in Vietnam when sexual trafficking had a hockey stick growth, right? How would I, as the staffer of a Christian organization, work with Buddhist leaders in Vietnam in stemming that problem? And you would look at like 4 interesting case studies of that and play out the role of what would I do in this case. So, but I think this relies on finding good case studies and frankly facilitating excellent discussion. Yes.
Hi, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So my name is Beth, and I'm a student at the Iowa School of Theology, and currently training to become a Unitarian Universalist minister. And so religious pluralism is one of our central kind of claims in our orientation system. And we don't really know what we're doing, honestly, a lot of the time. We're still figuring that out. So I kind of bring to the table how tricky this is. And so my question is, if you could kind of elaborate on what is that third way? Because like being together in a community,
Right.
engaging different
Yes.
perspectives.
Yeah. So thank you for that. By the way, I have not only deep affection and admiration for the Unitarian tradition, but a close relation to both. So Beacon, who publishes my books, is a Unitarian press. I actually just gave the major annual lecture at the General Assembly last year, which I had a great time doing. So I think that this question actually intersects very interestingly with Claude's question, and Claude's a challenge at the beginning, right? Which is, what's a method of, what is basically a paradigm of dealing with religious diversity that is not just, oh, you wash your hands before you pray, I wash my hands before I pray. We're really similar. By the way, you must be a Christian because that's exactly how we wash our hands, right? And I think that that's right. I think that is a big challenge, right? But frankly, I think that there's another big challenge, which is pretending that religious differences are basically the equivalent of interesting ethnic restaurants. Right? Religious differences tear societies apart, and you people in international studies know this better than anybody else. So I am only affirming something that you already know. So here's our approach to this at Interfaith Youth Corps. It's our paradigm of pluralism, right? Which I kind of laid out earlier, which has 3 parts, but a part of it that I don't frequently get to say, but I get to say to you, you know, the kind of a geekiness audience speaker match, I hope, is the assumption is diversity means deep disagreements. The assumption is diversity means deep disagreements, okay? So if you assume deep disagreements on profound matters, like whether eating meat is holy or evil, like whether gay marriage is holy or evil, like whether abortion is holy or evil, right? The list goes on and on and on and on and on, right? if you assume deep disagreements, the question is, how do you still have respect for identity? How do you still have relationships between people who orient around religion differently? And how do you still have a sense of working together for the common good? Here is how I think you do that. You find places of commonality. Here is where I think that differs from perhaps your initial reading of our work, which is that we assume deep disagreement, which is to say, finding commonality, you find commonality that is thick and that works, right? So if you bring together people who orient around religion differently, and there are people in the room who are pro-choice and pro-life, who are pro-gay marriage and against gay marriage, right? Who are pro-Iraq war and against Iraq war, who are pro-contraception and the Obama healthcare plan and against it. The question is, how do you have that group of people respect each other's identities, build positive relationships, and have a commitment to the common good? Our suggestion is you don't begin the conversation with abortion, right? Which is to say, the obvious, don't begin the conversation on the hyper-divisive issue. Simply assume that the hyper-divisive issues in fact divide people, and insist anyway that, if you will allow me to use religious language, relationships between people who are different are holy. And in order to make that reality, we are going to do the hard work of finding commonality that feels important enough for us to temporarily table our differences. By the way, we do this all the time, right? There are people in this room who disagree with who are on different sides of gay marriage, who are different sides of abortion, who are different sides of the Iraq war, and whose reasons for being on different sides are based on how they orient around religion. And you're here for a common purpose, hoping that I'm not boring, right? So this is how religiously diverse societies function. I think the millimeter that we are adding to this is that we have to be, first of all, one of the things I say to students in interfaith doctoral programs all the time is America is remarkable that we do this as a matter of course, right? And I'm being very geeky here around international studies stuff because I find this interesting, and I hope that this is something you all find interesting also. I want to give you two quick examples, right? So after 9/11, things were a bit more challenging for Muslims in America, but my family in India, after the Bombay Hindu-Muslim riots in 92, 93, they shut themselves in their apartment for a month. And not because they're paranoid, because my cousin saw a guy get his head chopped off with a machete 2 blocks from where he lived, right? By the way, India is a religiously diverse democratic society that speaks frequently of how proud they are of their diversity. In other words, they think they do it well, right? In 2002, after a train car carrying a group of Hindu zealots was somehow caught on fire, it got blamed on Muslims, and in the state of Gujarat, largely in the city of Ahmedabad, where incidentally my sister-in-law lived at the time, between 1,000 and 2,000 Muslims murdered in the streets. The police force, at the very least, stood by and watched, and in some cases aided and abetted. By the way, the man who is running for prime minister in India right now, Narendra Modi, was the governor of Gujarat at the time. Again, India is a place that prides itself on its diversity. What's the point that I'm making? That having a religiously diverse society in which, frankly, people don't slaughter each other in the streets over religious differences is remarkable, right? And we largely have it in the United States with very few exceptions. And we ought to ask ourselves the question, how is it that it exists here? My answer to that is because we generally have a way of being in America that says, I am willing to relate to you on an area of commonality, recognizing that we have other areas of profound difference. And my sense is that paradigm, that lens, is effectively a requirement for a pluralist society, right? Can you have a society in which people who orient around religion differently share the same state, but don't have that basic way of being in the world? I will repeat, the ability to relate to you positively on some areas of commonality, like being on the same PTA with you at school, sending our kids to the same Little League, going to the same university, even when we disagree profoundly on major matters, right? The only way you have a society that is diverse without that ethic is if you have tribalism. If you basically have the equivalent of a Kurdish quadrant, a Sunni quadrant, a Shia quadrant, et cetera, right? So this is an area that, I'm really interested in people pushing me on, because I say it emphatically, but I don't know if it's true. Yes.
Yes, so picking up on the commonality and particularly infrastructures that facilitate understanding. I appreciated the comments. King Dawson, citizen community. The realm of sport as a facilitating mechanism.
Yeah.
With the Australian Open,
Yeah.
tennis currently taking place.
Yeah.
The Winter Olympics forthcoming. Does sport, which transcends religion, having a commonality, a common activity, so to speak, does it enhance the differences in the competitive nature within our human nature?
Yeah.
Between nations, countries, and
Yeah.
individuals? Or is it a facilitating mechanism that actually helps to create understanding? After all, we have rules of conduct.
Right.
That we abide by.
Right.
We can compete, and we can still enjoy the activity because the activity seems to transcend the differences.
Right.
Your comments.
I think that's a really interesting insight. So to frame it in geekier language, sports can be a civic network, a la Varshney, what he calls a network of engagement that brings people who orient around religion or identity differently together in positive ways. It can also be the kind of thing that foments tribal hatreds and leads easily to civil war. It all depends on how it's run, which again is precisely the reason that this is a program that focuses on leaders, right? The ability to create soccer leagues in Iraq that bring Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds together in positive ways, as opposed to, oh yeah, the Kurdish gang against the Shia gang, let's see who wins. And by the way, the losers are gonna take their daggers out and stab other people, right? It's not like that doesn't happen. Witness European football matches, right? Seriously. And witness especially the anti-Semitism and the xenophobia and the racism. My own sense is that there are probably 4 institutions that played an important role in accelerating racial harmony within our society, okay? The military, the arts, higher education, and athletics. And my sense is, there's no science behind this, it's just a sense, is that athletics is probably the most important one. And the reason for that is because the way it was organized in visible ways tended to bleed down positively to prosaic ways, right? So if black and white people can get along on a baseball team together, right? They can get along on a little league, on a professional baseball team, they can get along on a little league diamond together. Right, so in other words, the kind of the integrational elements in visible ways started to format how we do things in pedestrian ways. But if organized incorrectly, it could fan the flames of tribalism. I will say one more thing about this, which is in my ideal imagined interfaith civic network, it's not a common activity. Bringing diversity together around a common activity is hugely important. But the ability to articulate how it is that your identity inspires you to engage in that common activity is just as important. Which is why at Interfaith Youth Corps, we choose service, volunteerism, over most other kind of mechanisms and methods. The reason is because every religion speaks to service. And so we think that if you bring people from different identities together around a service project, it is easy to facilitate a discussion about how your religion inspires service, which is also, in a way, a response to Claude's kind of initial challenge, which is, the term we use at IFYC is particularity, right? So what we talk about is how do you lift up commonalities and invite people to articulate how their particular narrative inspires them to engage in that commonality. So simple idea, you bring people from different religious backgrounds together to build a house through Habitat for Humanity, and you create this space for people to talk about how hospitality or mercy is important in their religious tradition. So you're not just saying, hey, we're all the same. There are Muslim narratives of mercy, there are Christian narratives of mercy, there are Buddhist narratives of mercy, but you are setting up a situation around a common activity and lifting up a shared value. Yes? Here first, and then.
I don't see anybody else here from the religious studies department, so I thought I'd stand up.
The chair is here behind.
Oh, except for the chair. Nice, nice. Good luck on your next paper, by the way.
In any case, I'm a master's student in the religious studies department. I'm doing an international multicultural focus, and so I'm a little disappointed that I'll be graduating before this certificate enters the, before they start losing classes.
You can come back and pay.
Yeah, right.
Come back, okay, good to know.
That's his Buddhist theology speaking there, by the way.
I practice Bible.
Yes.
I'm a part of the EU's Interfaith Advocates. I've participated in a lot of interfaith dialogues in other areas, and I really, really like what you're talking about. The thing that I've noticed, though, is that for the most part, when we get people together, and with these civic endeavors, it's the people who are willing to listen. It's the people who are willing to engage that are the only ones who show up. But for the most part, what I see is the violent aspect of religion comes from the people who aren't willing to engage, who aren't willing to go to the same little league, send their kids to the same little league as the ones who are the Muslims do. And I'm wondering, I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle is bringing them into the discussion, because that's ignorance. You said that we need to be fluent in our own religion and literate in the other. And I think that's important. Education, learning about the other, minimalizes fears of the other. And that's how we can live in a pluralistic society. And I'm wondering how you and your organization work to bring in the people who are resistant to these ideas.
Okay, so a hugely important question. So a couple of things here. By the way, this is going to disappoint you, right? And what I often say is that interfaith leadership and cooperation, the way we practice it at Interfaith Youth Corps, leaves everybody half full, because we're engaging in the real world, right? The real world in which people who orient around religion differently have deep disagreements, not just interesting differences, deep disagreements. By the way, one of my lines is, if you walk into a room with people who are like from different religions and different colors, and they all agree with you on the most important political issues of the time, it's not diversity. It might be interesting, but it's not diversity, right? So, your question is, how do we bring in people on the violent fringe? My answer to that is, we don't, okay? I actually think that's a different practice. That's the field of conflict resolution, right? My sense is it is a skill. If somebody were to say to me, Eboo, go to Fallujah or Baghdad and help them work it out, I'd be like, you got the wrong Eboo, right? I am like, my skill set is way afield from that. Now, what's interesting is perhaps in an international studies program, there are people with those skill sets. I mean, I would imagine there are, right? But our work at Interfaith Youth Corps focuses much more on what I would call mainstream religious communities and mobilizing social capital. Having said that, I still think that there is a major issue that you are, the question you're asking, I have a relevant response to it, instead of just saying I don't do that or we don't do that, right? Here's the relevant response: is that when DOMA came up before the Supreme Court, it's really funny, right? Like, I had my progressive friends saying, my progressive pro-gay marriage friends saying, there's an interfaith movement for DOMA. They send me Huffington Post pictures of people from different religions protesting outside. And my conservative friends were like, there's an interfaith movement against DOMA. And they were both right. And I would say that, I mean, I define the mainstream as basically 90% of people. And a big challenge in interfaith work is that what it generally is circling religiously diverse wagons around particular political convictions. My own sense is I don't think that's what interfaith work ought to be about. I think it's perfectly reasonable for D's to circle to mobilize a religious constituency and R's to mobilize a religious constituency. I would call that political campaigning. Perfectly reasonable, ought to happen. But I think interfaith work is about bridging divides between people who orient around religion differently. And what we're seeing from the most recent social science research is that the most important divides between people who orient around religion differently is their views of political matters, right? So I think what an interfaith leader ought to be doing, right, is and ought to have the skills to do is to walk into a pro-gay marriage Lutheran church and bring those folks to an interfaith activity, and an anti-gay marriage Lutheran church and bring those folks to an interfaith activity and say, well, obviously you guys disagree on gay marriage. We still live in a society where Lutherans have to learn how to get along, right? Or Muslims or Jews, or Jews and Muslims, etc., right? And the purpose of the space or activity that I'm setting up is to identify a profound commonality that you are willing to put your disagreement aside for. You see what I'm saying? But I think, at least, I tend to run with urban progressives, and my folks are terrible at walking into moderately conservative evangelical churches and saying, we'd love to work with you on sexual trafficking. We actually have a very similar view on that, right? We'd love to work with you on this range of things, and we recognize we disagree with you on this range of things. By the way, you can expect to see us on the other side of the picket line about abortion and gay marriage, etc., right? Welcome to a diverse democracy. But I think an interfaith leader has to have the skill set and, frankly, the inclination to be able to mobilize from multiple dimensions of the mainstream spectrum, which I'm defining as like the vast majority of a society.
It's not letting differences define your identity.
I don't want to use the word differences. I want to use the word disagreement, right? And the reason I want to use that is because I just want to be upfront with just like, I mean, this has happened to me like 1,000 times in 15 years of doing this, is that people will come into an interfaith space and they'll be like, oh, you guys are my people, right? And then somebody will say something and somebody else will be like, what the hell? And I'm like, what did you expect? Like I'll just tell one 10-second brief story. So I'm at like this interesting small Catholic college in Pennsylvania 6 months ago. And I'm on stage, they have me like on a panel with two students, right? One is a secular humanist and one is a cradle Catholic. And the secular humanist says, like just offhandedly on a stage in front of like 400 students, says, I'm really fascinated by religion, but I just find it downright evil that a parent would not let their kid choose a religion and instead would like oppress them by raising them in a religious tradition. And this like Catholic girl is like, you just call my parents evil, And this like sweet secular humanist kid had no idea, didn't want to do that. But the point is that was his fundamental worldview. And he thought that because people entered willingly onto a stage called interfaith cooperation, that she shared his worldview, right? I am much more interested in getting people whose orientations around religion mean really interestingly different worldviews and finding ways for them to work together on things. And there's a couple reasons I'm interested in that. One, because it's mobilizing social capital, and religious communities have by far the most social capital in a civil society. And number two, I guess there's three things. Number two, it's necessary for diverse society, right? You cannot have a diverse society unless people are willing to relate positively on things even when they know they relate negatively in other things. And the third thing is I believe it's holy. And I believe it is sacred when people who disagree profoundly on things are willing to relate on other things. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Joel. I'm a PhD student at Rhodes Scholar. So the previous question already addressed my first question, which was about selection bias. But my new question, I guess, from your answer, has to do with this incommensurability that you just talked about. You have an interfaith group over here, which is largely incommensurable with the violent killers over here. So my question to you as a sociologist of the subject would be, what do you think are the daily ritualistic or practices that are built into those individuals within each group as an actor engaged in each of these two activities? What do you think reigns or constitutes an actor that is participating here and participating here? What's that difference?
Yeah, such an important question. So, I mean, I'm a sociologist, right? So I have a bias in this. And actually, Acts of Faith, my first book, there's a thread of this in that book, which is I think it's institutions. What I mean to say is that for the most part, I don't think religious extremists are dramatically psychologically different than most other people. I think that they were effectively engaged by an institution, an Al-Qaeda, a Lord's Resistance Army, etc., that basically inculcated them into a pattern activity and a way of thinking, right? And I mean, I think his name is Terry McDermott, who writes a book about the September 11th hijackers, and he begins the book, and I actually I have this frame in Acts of Faith, with the image of Muhammad Atta, the leader of the September 11th hijackers, padding around his apartment in Hamburg wearing his skivvies and blue flip-flops. And what is disturbing about that image? That the dude is not inherently a monster. Now, I think that there are some people out there who are inherently monsters who psychologists deal with, right? The dude was like an alienated grad student who happened to run into a set of Qaeda operatives in Germany when he was particularly alienated. I think this is exactly what happened to the younger Sarnav brother, right? So it is what is, in the absence of those institutions, alienated, I mean, I hate to say it, but generally speaking, like 23-year-old men, right, would like do others, forgive my French, other stupid shit for 2 years other than join a religious extremist outfit. And then they would pass that stage and they would go on to other stuff. But when you have the Al-Qaedas of the world or the RSSs of the world who are actively seeking those young men, and especially, you know, in the case of Muslim extremism, starting them really early, like at 3 years old in madrasas, then you effectively have an institutional conveyor belt of terrorism or extremism. Now, you have to understand, I have a strong sociological bias here. It comes, you know, basically entirely out of Peter Berger, which is institutions explain the world. And there are other theories of this, but the other thing I'll say here is, this is how bin Laden becomes an extremist, right? If you read the story of bin Laden, either in Lawrence Wright's masterful The Looming Tower, or, you know, any other thing that basically tells us is bin Laden is a wealthy Saudi kid at the most elite institution in Saudi Arabia, Al-Thugr in Saudi Arabia, right? And he's like other wealthy kids, and he joins the soccer club, and he gets caught in the grip of the soccer coach, who is an Ikhwani guy who gets kicked out of Syria because of his Ikhwan connections, his Muslim Brotherhood connections, who winds up in Saudi Arabia, and his job is to recruit for, at that time in the late 60s and early 70s, you know, the Muslim extremism of that time, if you will, right? So bin Laden, that's how bin Laden gets in. Then he meets Abdullah Azam, who is basically the mastermind of what we might call contemporary Muslim institutional extremism, right? Post al-Banna in the Muslim Brotherhood. And then Afghanistan happens, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan happens. So bin Laden the mindset gets inculcated, and frankly, he has the chance to practice over the course of 10 years in Afghanistan. and he begins as a funder of this. So I sometimes think to myself, what would have happened if bin Laden hadn't come across that soccer coach? He'd be working for his dad's construction company in Saudi Arabia, I think, right? What happened if he hadn't hooked up with Abdullah Azzam? Right? So my sense is, from my strong bias as a sociologist, that you can basically trace any movement back to 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 institutions, and you can trace those institutions back to their key people. You can do that for bad movements or good movements, right? What if Rosa Parks hadn't gone to Highlander Folk School? And what if Miles Horton hadn't said Highlander's going to play a key role in the civil rights movement? Right? What if Martin Luther King Jr. had never crossed paths with a Gandhian scholar at Crozer Theological Seminary? One more question.
Everybody's intimidated.
Yeah. Right here.
Thank you for your wonderful and challenging articulate remarks with the commission. I don't have a booming voice, so I'll talk more this way. You talked about the necessity to use this to some practical case studies. There's a potential case study that I think is one of the most exciting in the world that faces us, and that concerns disease. There's only been one disease in the world that's been eradicated, and that's smallpox. There's another disease that is almost eradicated, but probably most of you, when certainly without experience, may not have even heard of, and that's polio. My wonderful colleague Grant Wilkins here started a movement through Rotary some 20 years ago.
Right.
It was instrumental. He doesn't like to say he started, but it was instrumental in the starting of the movement to eradicate polio in the world. And just this past week, it was announced that India has finally eradicated polio. But there are 3 locales in the world where polio still exists. And they tend to not be able to eradicate because of Muslim issues, literally killing the workers who are trying to immunize the children. So my question for you is, how might you reduce this to a case study? And how might you help? Because we are only one thing right away at an infected person in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
Coming here or going to other places in the world who are no longer immunizing and literally starting a new outbreak, major outbreak of polio in the world that used to kill hundreds of thousands of people a year and actually kill Grant's wife. I have polio as well, so I speak from some knowledge of this as well. How could what you espouse on a practical plane at Corbell or elsewhere help to eradicate polio in the world?
Thank you for that. It's, by the way, my dad joined Rotary because of the anti-polio campaign, because it was so inspiring to him. So I'm moved to have met the animating force in there. Thank you. I think it's an unbelievably inspiring example of how a civic network can deal with and eradicate a major problem, right? And it's the kind of, I think Rotary is as good an example of a network of engagement as you will find around the world. Not only does it build pluralism in places like India, but it also mobilizes social capital, as I think the polio campaign and the smallpox campaign illustrates so well. So, number one, let me just say, I mean, like, the people who like kill immunizers in Pakistan, I mean, they're like so beyond the pale. Not only are they not Muslim, they're barely human, right? I mean, like, I just find that so utterly ridiculous and so evil that I don't know what I have in common with that person. So let me just respond one more time. So there is actually let's say there's an extremist movement that says in the name of Islam that they kill immunizers because those immunizers are a part of Western colonialism. Let me be very clear. I disagree with them profoundly, right? And they are unbelievably beyond the pale. Let me also say that when people found out that one of the ways that the United States located Osama bin Laden, and I'm glad that we did, and I'm glad that he's gone, is by having American agents pose as immunizers. They were like, oh, great, this messes up public health initiatives in Pakistan for the next 25 years, right? So the reason I say that is because I just think, and I don't think the people who made that decision did it nefariously. I just think they did it stupidly, right? So I am not putting, the blame ought to be squarely on the people who look for public health workers and kill them. On the other hand, as practitioners of development or defense or foreign policy, that's why I have the line in this talk, we ought to know the religious energies in a particular place and do everything we can to fan the religious energies of pluralism and cooperation and to kill the religious energies of extremism, right? And that particular action served to fan the religious energies of extremism because it gave that group of, Paleolithic extremists the opportunity to say, look, we told you that the immunizers in our midst were part of the American security complex. I don't think there are easy answers to this, right? But I do think that people who are knowledgeable and skilled in diverse religious energies will have a better chance at creating situations where you can mobilize civic networks to eradicate diseases rather than people who ignore such energies. I know that's an unsatisfying answer. I wish I had a better one. What?
That's not satisfying.
So do you want me to say that I can get on the phone to Muslims in Pakistan, to a set of Muslim extremists in Pakistan and say, stop killing public health workers? Because I'll tell you something, if they had one bullet in their gun and they were in this room, the first person they'd shoot would be me. And I think that one of the most important things for people to understand in the world of religious diversity is that extremists will take out the moderates in their religion before they'll take out anybody else. So I wish I had leverage over them. I have zero.
There's no religious basis for their rejection of the campaign to eradicate polio. That's a corruption, that's a propaganda. It's local in Pakistan, it's just Muslims elsewhere have it.
So you raised, if I might take a moment, and that you referred to in dealing with religious or violent extremists and how to bring them to the table. And Eboo correctly said what work he does, but there's conflict resolution. So let me put a plug in for the fact that the University of Denver has a conflict resolution institute here, right? And there is another professor d'Estrée her name is Tamara Pearson d'Estrée, yes, we are related, whose actual expertise is intractable interethnic conflict. That's what she's been doing for her entire career. So one has to sort of look around for resources, and that's exactly that area. So if Eboo focuses on one group, it's not to say that there aren't people who are looking at those fringe folks and have worked very hard to figure out how to bring them to the table or to have some kind of discussion with them. I've watched in her career dealing with relatively short-term interethnic conflict, actually short-term, 50 to 100 years, to those that have been going on for 1,500 plus years, and the ability actually to, and there is a method to bring those folks to the table. So I would encourage you. Well, with that, let me again thank very much Dr. Patel for coming. It is an important parcel of the ongoing conversation and dialogue, and talk about perfect timing that you are here and that we're discussing putting together a certificate program, that the work that Gary has been doing with students since his arrival on campus in terms of interfaith discussion and dialogue. I think that this is, we need more of this kind of discussion, and I was very pleased that you were willing to accept our invitation. And again, John, wherever you are, just walked out the door, so thank you very much for, again, for his willingness to support today's talk. Thank you all for coming. Oh, yes, books. Books are back.